afternoon. My name is Sarah Byrne-Martelli, and I'm the Secretary of OCAMPR, and I'm happy to introduce our speakers for this afternoon's workshop called Orthodox Hospitality in Action, 3 Models. So our presenters are Daniel Hinshaw, Alison Perry Sower, Father Paul Albert, and it's moderated by Jane Carnahan Hinshaw. Dr. Daniel Hinshaw is an emeritus professor of surgery and palliative care at the University of Michigan with extensive experience teaching abroad. Alison Perry Sower is a licensed professional counselor, military family member, and nonprofit founder. Over the course of the past 17 years, she has worked with veterans in government, private sector, and nonprofit settings, including 6 years in the Department of Veterans Affairs, and is the founder and executive director of Central Oregon Veterans Ranch. Alison is a recent convert from Catholicism. Father Paul Albert is the rector of St. Peter and Paul OCA Cathedral in Detroit, Michigan. He and Curia Rosemary have worked together for more than 4 decades, serving the poor in various capacities, including missionary work in Guatemala. Father Paul also operates St. John's Sacred Art Studio as an iconographer and woodworker. And last but not least, Dr. Jane Carnahan Hinshaw, retired psychiatrist, is a retired psychiatrist with 30 years of veteran mental health care experience, as well as teaching abroad. And on a personal note, Dr. Jane Hinshaw and Dr. Dan Hinshaw have been important mentors for me when I did my Doctor of Ministry at St. Vladimir's, and just really wonderful people. And we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Sarah, and she was one of our star pupils, I will say. So we hope that this presentation will maybe be a good follow-up to some of the points that were brought up this morning and the questions of what do some of those things look like in practical ways. So we're going to present 3 models, and hopefully they will be an embodiment of sacred hospitality. So I'm just moderating, but my husband will be speaking first to give us some overview about some thoughts about sacred hospitality, and then presenting a model of a home for the dying, potentially. It is not in existence, but we have been working on it for years with Father Paul Albert. Then Alison will present a model that is in existence, this home for veterans, therapeutic ranch of healing, and Father Paul will be the last presentation about his work with the homeless and the poor in inner city Detroit. We brought 2 special icons. St. Elizabeth for us is really kind of a modern embodiment of sacred hospitality. I'm sure most of you know her story. She's also a recent convert's patron saint, so it's good to have her here. And the St. Basil icon was written by Father Paul in his studio, and we wanted it to be here with us today because in some ways we see St. Basil as an embodiment of what we're talking about. He is feeding the lepers there, and in some ways the 3 cohorts we're talking about, the dying, the homeless, and the veterans, are really our modern day lepers. So we'll start with Dan, and then after that I will begin the Q&A with 3 questions each of our panelists, and then we invite you to come and ask questions yourself.
We've heard some wonderful presentations already at this conference, and I think it's helpful though for this particular workshop to give some working definitions for the purposes of our discussion in this next hour. So the ancient Greek word philoxenia is usually translated into English as hospitality, but literally you could translate it as love of the stranger. And in fact, the laws of hospitality, of course, govern the laws of nations. International law came out of the laws of hospitality. Hospitality rules across a wide spectrum of endeavors. And there was a distinction made earlier by Dr. Thomas in her presentation between hospitality per se and sacred hospitality. And so I think that's a good thing to remember as we talk about it now. And she also alluded to the Latin cognate of xenos, which is the Greek word that is often translated as stranger or foreigner, and this Latin word is hospes. And both words are the root for the words in English, hospes for hospitality, hospital, hospice, and so on. And in the Greek tradition, xenos became more and more associated with care of the sick and the formation of early hospitals, on one of which was certainly probably established by St. Basil. But the other thing I wanted to kind of emphasize right now is there's a fundamental ambiguity in these words. So if you look in a classical Greek lexicon, the usual meaning for for xenos, and in the Latin also hospes, is the stranger, the one who is the guest, the one who is seeking hospitality. But they also can be used in the context of the host. So this host-guest interaction is something we want to explore in different ways here. So one of the things that's happened, though, from a Christian standpoint, is that the sick person has taken on the character of the xenos, the stranger, the person who is estranged from their fellow human beings because of the illness. And of course, the most extreme examples in the ancient times were the lepers. The estrangement, though, isn't just between us, or between the ill person and other persons, but because of sin, the estrangement has extended even to the entire cosmos and our Creator. And of course, this is why in the traditional understanding, the incarnation was to bring us, to break that barrier of estrangement, to bring healing to the world. So then this host-guest dynamic of hospitality defines the essential character of the therapeutic encounter, wherein the host offers support and help in a safe setting to the vulnerable person, who in turn offers a mysterious reciprocity, a form of healing that is hard to define, but I think all of us have probably, if we've been involved in these kinds of therapeutic encounters, recognize it as a very real experience, that sometimes we come out of an encounter experiencing a profound healing that we didn't expect. And so, in essence, the healer is the patient, and the patient is sometimes the healer. Now, we're confronted with a problem, though, in our Western culture, and that is that the sterile environment of the modern clinic or hospital may not offer a sense of safety to the medical guest, and furthermore, it may not be conducive to a reintegration of the whole person, especially for those who have experienced severe trauma or are suffering intensely, whatever the illness might be. So to kind of think about this in a large sense, that for us Orthodox Christians, since each human person is an icon of the Creator, human relationships naturally extend then beyond the encounters between individuals to include the entire creation. In essence, holistic healing will simulate, as much as possible, a movement back toward paradise, where we, Father Roman Braga of late memory, blessed memory, said we have a nostalgia for paradise as human beings. And so this is, I think, in essence, is something pulling us back to an encounter with what Dostoevsky talked about, the beauty that will save the world. But then how does one place healing in this larger cosmic context in a world limited by the immanent and governed by the medical industrial complex? And so the three models that we're going to talk about are an attempt to kind of place hospitality as part of in its relationship to healing and healing ministries in this different light. So I already mentioned a little bit about St. Basil. I just want to emphasize that physicians in antiquity, even early Christian physicians, were often encouraged in the education systems that they formerly went through to not treat hopeless cases. It's bad for your reputation. If you're taking care of people who die, I mean, who's going to want you to come and care for them? But there was a huge frame shift, essentially, with the efforts of people like St. Basil the Great, when he actually took these people on and said, look, we're going to care for them. We're going to enfranchise them. We're going to make them recognizable as citizens and human beings who are created in the image and unto the likeness of God. And in fact, in his program that he developed to treat lepers, he was really, in a sense, bringing hope to people who had, for all intents and purposes, been given up as hopeless. And so this was a radical form of hospitality, so that he began to include guests or individuals as guests in this host-guest dynamic that were usually excluded from any kind of hospitality before that. And in fact, in his funeral oration at his death, his friend St. Gregory of Nazianzus went even further in extolling this radical frame shift that had come to Christianity because of Basil's efforts. Speaking of his friend, he said, he did not therefore disdain to honor with his lips this disease, that is the leprosy, which was also known as the elephant disease because of the thick skin. Noble and of noble ancestry and brilliant reputation though he was, but saluted them as brethren. Basil's care was for the imitation of Christ by cleansing leprosy not in word, but in deed. Now, I think Jane mentioned that we have not had any successful program. We've certainly tried over many years in North America, developing Orthodox programs for caring for the people at the end of life. And I'll talk a little bit about why this might be more difficult here, but I wanted to share a little bit of experience we've had in terms of teaching in other settings, specifically in Orthodox settings. And we've been blessed to have a lot of experience working in Romania over almost 20 years. So the Romanian Orthodox Church at this point, I think, has two of them are directly under the church, and I think another one is from a pious physician. But there are two hospices dedicated to St. Nectarius in Romania. One is in Bucharest, one is in Cluj. And hospice dedicated to St. Irene is in a town called Voluntar, which is basically a suburb of Bucharest. The Greek Orthodox Church, and basically in the person of Metropolitan Nicolaus of Mizogaia, he's a bishop in the Athens area, came to an Orthodox conference in Romania, and he and Archbishop Vasile of blessed memory got up at the end of the conference in 2008 and said, we're going to start hospices. And so Archbishop Vasile founded the one in Cluj, in the north of Romania, and Galilee Hospice is thriving in Athens. And I think to this date is still the only hospice in Greece. And the Antiochian Orthodox Church, the Patriarchate in Lebanon, up until the time of the bombing and the financial collapse there were several Orthodox dedicated individuals forming the first home hospice program called Sower, which I think means together in Arabic. But the picture here is interesting because this gives you a sense of why it's difficult in this country to do this kind of work, because this is a picture of a small hospice that is actually not directly sponsored by the Orthodox Church. Jane and I were there during a Maslu service or a healing unction service. They didn't have 7 priests available, but they had 3. And the priest that's closest to us in the audience is actually a hospice nurse who works there. And so they took a break. You can't see all of them, but the patients who could get out of their beds were all standing there in their own hospice setting, experiencing this anointing service, not having to be dragged to a church or something, but bringing it to them in this otherwise secular institution, and fully embraced by the culture. This is something that would be very problematic to do in the United States or in Canada. So how to kind of differentiate some of the challenges we have versus, say, the old country, the old historic Orthodox countries. So in the old country, there's still frequently state support for religion. Clergy are often still paid salaries by the government. The Orthodox culture, at least at some level, is still quite prominent and present and dominant in many ways. Religion can be openly integrated into the plan of care, including rituals and so forth. I think a number of colleagues have already mentioned their difficulties with trying to do this as chaplains in this country, and still integrate their orthodoxy more fully into that. This is usually not a problem there. The church, of course, has more resources, especially Romania, and the regulation is less intense. So these are things in favor of being able to set up and establish these kinds of programs. The downside, of course, though, is they treat them, the House of Insurance, for example, in Romania, treats these institutions as hospitals, and they expect them to bill, and so you get into the whole government billing relationship, and this creates a whole another set of problems. Now, in the United States, of course, there's a aggressive separation of church and state. There's intense regulation of healthcare. Medicare has created a massive medical industrial complex which favors large academic medical institutions being formed. And of course, disunity among the Orthodox jurisdictions also makes it more complicated. I'll just summarize quickly the last two slides. The Medicare hospice benefit, however, offers an opportunity to us because there are a couple of gaps in care. The people who need homebound, or who would essentially become homeless because they don't have the resources to cover their home care, whether they're homeless on the street or they just have inadequate support at home. Medicare, the hospice benefit doesn't cover that. It covers medications, it covers visiting nurse. It's a wonderful program as far as it goes. So there's an opportunity there to either develop small homes, like group homes for the dying, and the other option would be to use church halls, for example, maybe once a week to provide respite to the caregiver, so that the family caregiver could actually have a break. And then you could see a sliding scale between those two extremes. And I'm going to end with that, but just say that we can talk more about it in the discussion. And then our next speaker is Alison Sower, and she's going to provide a real living example of it, where we never quite were able to make happen yet.
Oh, it's doing something automatically on its own. Well, I guess we're going to start. So, last year, so 8 years ago, I founded a nonprofit for veterans. Prior to that, I worked within the VA system for 6 years in Portland VA Hospital in Portland, Oregon, and then also in a community-based outpatient clinic in Central Oregon. So the nonprofit turned 8 years old last year, and we had the opportunity to partner with a Los Angeles-based production company to make a documentary that has won awards in Europe and also at Psychology Film Festivals. So if I could get the lights, please. And I see this on the screen, but not here or where to hit play. So Keith, if I could get you to come out of here.
The first time we came to this property, I stood on this porch, I looked out at those mountains, and I saw the vision that was in my head.
This place has a certain equation to it that just works. It's more peaceful, it's not bright lights and white walls, it's nature.
It's not prescribed. I would call it an organic approach to healing.
I was in the Marine Corps, combat veteran, and this ranch here is the only safe place I've ever found that I can be safe, feel safe.
When I came home, I couldn't believe the incivility of how we were treated. We were disrespected, we were spat upon. So like most of my brothers in the Vietnam era, we just shut up. We became mute.
For me, last July, I was at the point where I pulled a pistol in my head. I was completely drunk, a drunken mess, didn't want to be anywhere, didn't want to be around people anymore. And I was able to come here and talk to people about the trauma.
I've seen it fundamentally change the lives of veterans who come here.
It's tough to get people to come out here, but once they do, every single time, it's like, I can't believe I took that long to come out here.
If I had one word to describe the ranch, it would be the sanctuary.
Tranquility.
Healing.
Community. Love sounds so simple, but that's what it is. I think we need many more places like this.
It might seem too good to be true, but at Cover, it's actually legit. It's real.
If you haven't been here, people just don't understand what this place is about. It makes a difference. You're at peace, and when you're at peace, it opens up the whole world in front of you.
So veterans often come home from war feeling like a leper, feeling like an outcast from society, not able to relate to the general civilian population. And one of the primary reasons, what I've heard most often, is because of moral injury. And I've heard veterans describe themselves as monsters, that they come back and they feel like monsters and they don't feel that they can integrate into the broader population. So this leads to a sense of alienation, and then it leads to isolation. And I used to tell veterans in my clinical practice that isolation kills, because the more they isolate and remove themselves from relationships and community, the more their post-traumatic stress symptoms and moral injury and existential crisis, identity crisis, all of that kicks in. It's why it's so important to create places that build community and connection for combat veterans specifically. So this vision came about for me. I was working at the Portland VA Medical Center in 2007, and I was sharing a case of a young Iraq combat veteran. He was 22 years old. He had also, when he'd come home from his deployment, had been drugged and sexually assaulted by his combat buddy, the one person in the world he trusted, and was suffering from symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia. And he, not surprisingly, ended up in the psychiatric ward in the lockdown unit at the medical center. And his social worker and I got a call saying that he was throwing furniture and threatening staff. And I had an immediate reaction to this because of everything I knew this young man had been through. And I knew he was safe, but I knew there was so much more he needed to be experiencing, something more holistic. And I looked at my colleague and I said, I wish we had a sheep ranch out east where we could send these guys, where they could work on the land, sleep under the stars, and be in a community of other veterans. So I left the VA in 2012. I took 2 years working to get this off the ground, and we started operations in 2015. The mission statement, which I was actually really surprised that the retired military officers on our advisory board and then board of directors agreed to use the word spirit in the mission statement, because I thought, doesn't that sound esoteric to them? Does anybody know what that really means? It's not very concrete, but that's the mission statement, and it still is to this day, a working ranch that restores purpose and spirit to veterans of all ages and all eras. So it's a 19-acre working farm with llamas, sheep, chickens. We have a hydroponics greenhouse, lots of physical activities for veterans to get involved in. The model is 3 pillars, agriculture, peer support, and a future program which is very similar. It was just a divine connection with Dan and Jane, who have very similar vision for end-of-life care in a small home setting. So that is something that has not launched at the ranch, but the vision is for specialized end-of-life care in this pastoral setting for combat veterans, so ministering specifically to the needs of combat veterans at end of life. The next few slides, I want to just talk about what are some of the properties of this model that really exemplify sacred hospitality. So beauty. Beauty is not something that you hear spoken about often in veteran circles. I've never been to a VFW where there was a conversation about beauty. I've heard beauty referred to as the language of the soul, and then in putting this together, I thought beauty is really God's hospitality towards us. There's a natural order. What's so beautiful about this model is it's about generativity, it's strength-based, it's about what can you do, what can you offer, and participating in generativity, which is the opposite of death and destruction. It's a sanctuary, it's a safe place. For a clinical term, it's trauma-informed, non-institutional. There's a very limited flow of civilian engagement at the ranch. We'll do specific events to invite the community in, such as an annual plant sale or an annual harvest fest. So the veterans get to actually, they have a sense of pride, they have a sense of ownership. They build, they maintain, they've been involved at every level, from the boots on the ground to the board of directors, to create this and to sustain it. I often call it a monastery for veterans. So they very much view it as their place and have referred to it as sacred space or hallowed ground, even though there are no overt religious associations with it as a nonprofit. And really this piece of the peer-to-peer peer support. So we have peer support groups specifically for OEF, OIF vets, Vietnam vets, and blended, etc. Dan mentioned this notion of the stranger going from stranger to guest to intimate to fully integrated community member. And that's what this model does. And it takes these veterans who feel alienated and isolated and brings them into community. And then we hear amazing stories of post-traumatic growth, of them going back out into the broader community. So this is really about reintegration in its truest sense. This picture is one of our veterans here on the right. He's a Marine Corps combat veteran instructor, veteran with PTSD, and two veterans from the Oregon State Hospital, which many of you know is where One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was filmed. So we are 2.5 hours away from the Oregon State Hospital. The hospital administration gave permission to veteran staff and veteran peer support specialists to bring veteran residents from the state hospital over to our farm, to the Veterans Ranch, once a month for a field day. And that is, to me, one of the most beautiful examples of sacred hospitality and our veterans becoming hosts themselves, because they hosted these vets who are even more marginalized than them because they're deemed criminally insane. And so one of our veterans was a retired 22-year Army veteran. He was Filipino, and he used to make homemade Filipino food for 20 people. Now, he had physical injuries, so he wasn't very involved at the ranch on a regular basis, but his way to show hospitality, his way to help his peers, was to make homemade Filipino food for 20 or 25 people and come and drop it off at the ranch. And this idea where the veterans become the hosts themselves, offering hospitality, becomes this reciprocal healing. And it also is the restoration of their dignity, their identity, their purpose. They're able to give rather than being seen as needing charity or needing something from others. They come to receive and to give. And if I had a lot more time, I would talk to you so much more about this because I'm so passionate about it. And this is my final slide, and this is just something that Jake Daly, he's a regenerative farmer up in Washington State. He was a combat medic in the Army in Iraq. And he says, we're not just restoring the soil, we're restoring our souls. And it's really this beautiful combination of the agriculture and participation in God's creation, and with God's humanity, God's beautiful human beings helping each other, that helps with that restoration. So, thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm the least
technologically savvy of the group, so bear with me. I was thinking today, it was about 9 years ago, Archbishop Paul Gassios, I don't know if you're familiar with him, of thrice blessed memory. He's the bishop in Chicago and here in the Midwest. Approached me and invited me to, I was on a sabbatical at that time, and invited me to visit a parish in the inner city of Detroit. And being there, I came away with a very distinct impulse in my thoughts, my heart, my soul, which is this church was built in the original church in 1907. It was the oldest church in the state of Michigan, first Orthodox church in the state. The church that's existing there now was built in the late 1940s. The whole neighborhood was Slavic, hundreds and hundreds of people. When I was visiting there were probably 20 people in the church still holding on. And Archbishop said, I'm not really wanting you to go there with the mindset of trying to revive or resuscitate a dying community, but I'd like to know, is it possible for us as a diocese to repurpose this place for mission work in the inner city of Detroit? And I left there the first few visits thinking it would be really a shame to see the Orthodox presence in such a place of need and poverty disappear. So over the course of the next many months, I would always call it like the stone in my shoe. I just couldn't stop thinking about this and praying about it. And so I was assigned for a year. It was a one-year assignment to just see what could be done. And at the end of that year, His Eminence, we sat down and talked, and all he wanted to know is, was I still encouraged? He said, I want to be encouraged. So that's where we started with this conversation. What we learned, I think, in the very initial period of time with a small group that were becoming, coalescing as very missionary-minded, was that there are many ways to extend the works of mercy into the world as Orthodox Christians, but for us, we felt it was very important to keep together in a whole way the Eucharistic community coupled with a response to the needs of those immediately around us. And as the one-year assignment, this is my 9th year. I'm finishing my 8th year, and I'll probably, God willing, be completing one more year before our seminarian graduates from St. Tikhon's and comes to replace me, God willing, next year. So, the wedding of the Eucharistic community to the inner city ministries, the church being repurposed for mission work, is primarily, I'd say, about 30, 35 individuals who are at the core of that community. It's a very small group. And this is one of the most beautiful sentences or two that I have found in the Divine Liturgy, in the Eucharistic prayers of thanks at the anaphora. And when we had fallen away, thou didst raise us up again, and did not cease to do all things, until thou hast brought us up to heaven, and hast endowed us with thy kingdom which is to come. He did not cease to do all things. And I think this was really, in the earlier phase of our coming together as a group of missionaries at St. Peter and Paul, we really felt these words of Scripture to be compelled by the love of Christ. This was a motivation that wasn't coming together because of an agenda or a business plan or even a vision model, but really being moved to respond to the needs that were present. St. Peter and Paul is in an area where over the last 9 years there's been a lot of folks on foot, and the city, if you know anything about Detroit, has been developing, and new money coming in and gentrifying of areas around us. So the homeless population has been somewhat pushed from place to place, and a lot of the homeless that we serve are veterans. Some are on the street out of struggle with mental illness, some by choice. But the group that we are serving has presented to us an opportunity. So we're responding to that opportunity. The missionary work, the works of mercy, the presence of a Eucharistic community are really at the heart of what we're trying to unpack in our setting. Our church doors on Sunday morning are open. People come in. They come in, they'll hear the prayers or the singing at matins or the liturgy, and this seems to be the way that things are presenting themselves to us. The next point that I'm going to read through this, the tree of life being replanted on Golgotha. At Golgotha, God replants the tree of life. With the repentant thief, we draw near to the suffering servant, the crucified one, who rose from the dead, conquering death by death. From our hymns for the Feast of the Veneration of the Cross, the Church has been revealed as a second paradise, having within it, like the first paradise of old, a tree of life, the cross. By touching it, we share in immortality. So in this sense, I think this was also part of what we were realizing, this impulse or this inspiration among our missionaries was that the church has to be present. And the sense of the cross being planted on Golgotha, that the crux moment of our Lord's ministry was to lift up, like Moses did in the wilderness, that very image that casts the most fear in our hearts, which is suffering and death, and to reclaim that place where literally people, we've been with people who have died on the street that were part of our Sunday routine, and then all of a sudden they're gone and they have no family and not even a person to pray over them at the time of their parting. I mean, it's a pretty stark setting where we find ourselves, but to find that the church is there present to be touched. I know that we do a lot of volunteer work, and even our setting at Peter and Paul, we rely heavily on the responsiveness of a lot of volunteers. There's probably 25 Orthodox churches in the greater Detroit area. And I'd say a strong 15 or more of those churches for the last 9 years have been a big part of what sustains us. So moving on, at each divine liturgy, our Father feeds us. From his holy table, the people of God partake of the heavenly manna, the fruit of our salvation in the flesh and blood of the Son of God who takes away the sin of the world. And we immediately in turn from that holy altar of our sanctified and grace-filled hearts extend this Eucharistic celebration by setting a table to share with our neighbors. So our primary outreach ministry is on Sunday, following the Eucharist, as an outpouring of our agape. We have for many years now a Sunday meal to about 100 of our neighbors, young and old, homeless, some with a roof over their heads but impoverished. And that has become for them their church. Some of them have found their way to our Eucharistic worship, but for the most part, we're extending the joy of our celebration, touching and being in the presence of our Lord at Holy Communion with our neighbors. And that flow in itself of the day is a big part of what we have been enjoying, even with our volunteers coming from other churches and celebrating with us. So the next thing is the pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father is this: to visit the widows and orphans in their trouble and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. So here again is another reason why the Eucharistic community, the presence of a parish, a pastor, a core group or involved in the sacramental life is so important. Having the whole package put together helps those who are serving. Those who are opening hospitality to our neighbor. Oftentimes we all understand the struggles with burnout and the overwhelming sense of not being able to fix a whole lot or solve a whole lot, but to continue to serve. So in the icon with St. Basil, which was taken from St. Gregory's eulogy of this saint, we include the caregivers also being blessed and prayed over by the saint. So caring for the caregivers in the sacraments, particularly of communion and confession, are two of the greatest medicines for keeping us, as St. James says, striving to be unspotted from the world. All of our baptismal garments get dirty in this work, but we have a way of cleaning them and keeping them unspotted. Continuing, this is really a beautiful insight from Father John Breck. The chief end of man, of the human person, is to glorify God, to enjoy Him forever, to glorify God, enjoy Him forever, insofar as we strive to glorify God by accepting the narrow way of conformity to His will, to His commandment of love. It becomes possible to welcome one another, to receive, serve, and love one another as Christ has welcomed us. This is how we truly glorify God, and by this very act we come to know that God leads us through this world, not for judgment or condemnation, but for life. We come to know in the depths of our being that our chief end, the only real purpose and meaning in our life, is to know God, to glorify Him, to enjoy Him, to rejoice in Him forever. I know that one of the wisest things I've heard is when you start a journey, begin with the end in mind. This is the end. As we heard last night, our journey that we're all on is ultimately towards theosis, to commune and enjoy God. And I think that the joy of this Eucharistic life that the Orthodox in our mission setting are experiencing and cultivating with those in the parish and our volunteers is one that is felt very much by our neighbors who pass through our doors and that we serve. And we all, I think, feel very strongly that those who serve as Orthodox missionaries go home at the end of the day feeling far more blessed than the people that we're serving of providing food and clothing and encouragement. And here again, why we do what we do, and this is another icon that it shows a lot. It's from the book of Tobit, and this is from chapter 12 of Tobit. This is the Archangel Raphael revealing himself finally in this beautiful story from the Old Testament. When you did not hesitate to rise and leave your dinner in order to go and lay out the dead, your good deed was not hidden from me, but I was with you. So now God sent me to heal you. Here the healer is being healed. I am Raphael, one of the 7 holy angels who present the prayers of the saints and enter into the presence of the Holy One. I think if I could come up with an icon, an image that shares the joy of our journey towards union with God, this would be it. And it's an image of all of the church, heavenly and earthly, combined in this work. Sorry I didn't have more time. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to invite our 3 speakers to come up, and we will start out. We're going to have to skip some. Oops. Okay, we'll skip the last slide. Okay, I'm going to start us out with just a brief question to each of our panelists, and then after that we'll invite anyone to come to the mic that wants to. Plus, since we have so much to say in such a short time, the 3 panelists are going to stay through the break, and you're welcome to come up and talk to them. So this is for Dan to start out. And how do you see the therapeutic therapeutic encounter grounded in hospitality, differing from conventional clinical encounter?
Thank you. We live in a world where we are very successful at a reductionist approach to healthcare. So we define illness experience in terms of discrete diseases that we can treat and bill for and develop large health systems to manage all of this. In the process of this, we lose the person in the midst of in the midst of their suffering, unfortunately. And so I think what we're proposing, I think, in these different models is to return to a profound form of simplicity. And that can only be grounded in the encounter between persons who are cognizant of their relationship as an image of the relationship between each human suffering soul and their creator.
Okay, for Alison, for people with a wide range of religious backgrounds, how would you incorporate a Christian ethos into a program similar to your ranch? And do you have any specific examples to share beyond what you already shared?
Coming from a Catholic background, one of the things that I was a question I had when I converted to Orthodoxy, which was just this year, was about social services and so the church in the world and what kind of work did the church do in the world. And one of the things that I experienced, particularly at a Trappist monastery in Oregon, and I often refer to the Veterans Ranch as a monastery for veterans, was that it was open to everybody, everyone was welcome, and they had a very specific and overt Christian, obviously, presence and identity and monastic identity, community. But everyone was welcome, and they had that in their literature for lodging and retreat. The original vision for this was actually to have retreat space as well. So, I mean, literally to have it like a monastery with, the veterans caring for each other at all stages of life, and then veterans coming on retreat. And so I think it's really, in my experience at the Veterans Ranch, I'm no longer the executive director, but still an advisory capacity with the organization. The Christian principles were coming through me as the leader and the point person of the organization. And there were a few other believers and a few other veterans there that were also Christian. And that ethos really came through what we did, even though it wasn't explicitly stated often. So I think it's how we minister to people like Dan setting in this encounter and seeing Christ and seeing each person as sacred. And so there is also something that could be more overtly Orthodox, and I'm pointing to my husband because I'm newly married and Jane and Dan are our sponsors. But he's also a combat veteran, and so we're discerning what this might look like from a specifically Orthodox framework. And again, the term that keeps coming back to me is a monastery for veterans. So it's really up to God to define the rest.
Thanks, Alison. And I would just add, when Dan and I were visiting in Central Oregon and went to liturgy, we were surprised and delighted to see the guy with the kind of Viking hair. He's become Orthodox. He's part of the parish. Okay. So, Father Paul, if someone wants to start a similar kind of program to what you have, do you have any advice of how to get started?
Sure. And come visit us if you're interested. We did the same thing. We spent some time with Father Abernathy in Pittsburgh, who's was part of Focus originally. Paul Finley and Cleveland, there's 3 Pauls that just struck me, in the Rust Belt. I'm not sure what that means. Paul Finley is Focus, St. Herman House in Cleveland. And just the visits helped a lot. A lot of our inner cities have still churches hanging on, maybe like ours, that could very potentially be a vital link, like what we want to become as a hub for Detroit. So the Orthodox, we've reached out to our brother clergy. It's a hard sell at first, but to think of Saints Peter and Paul not as another parish that's existing in a sea of parishes in Detroit, but as a missionary hub which could become an extension of your parish. So a lot of our suburban churches have what I would call, and it's not by chronological age, but maturing Orthodox Christians. People who are wanting to really roll up their sleeves and get some work done. And we start out sometimes, my wife and I, we traveled to Guatemala. We were working with Protestant mission in the inner city of Toledo for many years, but we wanted to see something close to home that could really take. So I would say in most of our middle-sized to larger cities, look and see who's out there. If there's a parish that, I think for us it was the right ingredients. We were in the right place at the right time. We had a bishop who was responsive and got the vision. And we're very blessed. Our new bishop, Archbishop Daniel, same way, very supportive of this being an inner Orthodox possibility. So I think it's something that can be coordinated. The one part of our model that I think is a little unique is that as a hub for mission work, when I talk to my brother priests, I say, you may have someone in your parish or family that you could send, if it's once a month or for a year, as a missionary, to come worship with us, pray with us, because I think the key ingredient for all of us is we know the people, as Dan was saying, it's eye to eye and person to person. The people we serve on Sunday, their names are at my holy altar. They're people that we pray for. And the parishes that have, there's a few priests in the Detroit area that when they would have like a mission Sunday in their parish, Saints Peter and Paul came up. And the whole notion was get down there, get to know the people that you're serving, and stretch your wings a little. This might be for you, it might not be for you, but we have now missionaries that come in and then they go back. They're blessed by their parish and sent, which is an added gift as well. And then they go back to their parishes as liaison, so they have a more immediate sense of what we're doing and what the needs are. And then they can convey that to their congregations. And we've mobilized just some amazing resources. One of the parishes every year now provides, it's a massive event. It's they call it the Christmas food basket, but it's food that fills a car. And there's a school with impoverished families nearby us. So every year, like 120, 130 families come with their cars, and there's probably 60 volunteers, and the whole parking lot's filled with food and non-perishable items that get distributed.
And Christmas gifts for the kids too. Yeah.
So that's maybe where to start. Anybody who's interested, you can feel free to email or check our website as well and get a sense of it. But I think it's a model that could very easily translate or transpose to almost any city in the country.
Anyone else that would like to ask questions?
I just want to thank all of you for your presentation. It was wonderful. I wanted to share some good news. It's always good to hear good news. So Father Paul, it relates mostly to what you presented. I've been attending in Chicago, as you said, the inner cities, some of the churches are hanging on. So one of the churches in Chicago is the Assumption of the Theotokos. And for those of you who are not from Chicago, it is in a zip code that is either the second or third deadliest homicide zip code in the nation. Right? So you guys have all heard stories about Chicago. So this church is literally in that deadliest zip code. And the parishioners, it's a very well-established parish. In fact, this parish has produced more priests than any other church, single church in the country. This church. Think about the Virgin Mary, what she's doing here. So they are in this community. Now, all the parishioners, they don't live there. They don't live in the zip code. They all moved out to the suburbs. But every Sunday, they come in for worship. But to your point, this is the good news. They've established an outreach to this African American community that is dealing with homicides every week, and with the police department as well. And this handful of parishioners, they go and they provide food, they take it to the community center, they help. Every Sunday at coffee hour, we see Chicago policemen come and hanging out. And they take some of the leftover foods and they take it back to the police department. So it's that outreach. In fact, one of the parishioners who leads this was just given an award by the police of Chicago and the community for their love and their outreach to the community. So think about that. This is like one of the deadliest zip codes in the country. But here an Orthodox church is saying, we don't live near you, we don't even live here, but we still want to show our love and support. So I just wanted to share that good news.
Thank you.
Father?
Thank you very much for your presentation. I think something that I'm struggling to kind of understand is the hospitality and the sacred hospitality, and we've kind of been talking about that for a while now. In our small parish in Springfield, Vermont, we have a food distribution, and we actually built a small chapel outside of our church. It's dedicated to St. Herman of Alaska. It's a food chapel. So we just put food over there, and people come anytime, day or night, 24/7. It's open. We have a prayer box to where people can leave, like, please pray for me, and so on. And I think because it's almost like it's a little bit removed, people feel free to come. There's so much traffic, even at midnight, I see people coming with a flashlight in there, so since then we put a light there. But the next step, and even for our food distribution, some people are a little more hesitant about that because there's that personal contact and so on. But they come. And the question, I guess, that I have is, if we know, there's that hospitality that we provide, and then there's the sacred hospitality, and especially bringing the presence of Christ kind of in the middle of it all. And how do we do that? How do you have that discernment, maybe especially for you, Father, to invite people? I don't even know how to say it. For example, we had food distribution, and I'm always kind of so glad to give food away and so on. But I'm hesitant to say, oh, come to our services or anything like that, because I don't want it to be attached. We want to be hospitable. But the funny thing is, one of my parishioners said to one of the guys who came, hey, you should come to our services. And the guy came, But I think there's that hesitancy to kind of have strings attached to this hospitality. But sometimes that's to the detriment of the people we're serving. So how do you know when to make that connection?
I think both Archbishop Paul and now Archbishop Daniel have expressed their personal wishes that we're not necessarily on the forefront proselytizing, but that we joyfully share. I'll give you an example, because I'm going to take this probably, I hope, into eternity, and I hope it's up rather than down. It was around Theophany, and we had, our Sunday meals had grown up to about 100. About 100 of our neighbors would just show up for the afternoon meal on Sundays. And I thought, well, we had been doing this a few years, and all we ever do is pray and bless the food. We ask people if anybody's sick, if there's any, we'll pray together for the neighbors. But this year I thought, well, doggone it, I'm going to set up a little table like I would do for house blessing. And before we did the meal, the prayer to bless the food, I did about a 7-minute short little house blessing service. It was right around the feast. And I was, we were oriented east with the icon up, and I had my back to everybody. There were 100 people there. They were pretty quiet. I didn't know what was going on. And as I turned with the holy water, and we started singing the tropar, and I was going with the little water container and the sprinkler, and everybody there, people that were really like the rough and tumble crowd on a normal Sunday, they had their eyes closed and their hands were cupped like they really wanted that blessing. And I just felt like it was a very moving moment for us, the hosts, because we hadn't given them a chance, up until then we were almost like sort of apologetic about, didn't want to impose too much. But I realized that there were many opportunities in a non-imposing way that became very joyful for us. We started weaving like these seasonal feast day, we're going to pray. And people came to expect that, So I think it just is something you almost have to gauge and discern more pastorally as to the timing of that.
Thank you.
I think we could keep talking for many more minutes. So as Jane has mentioned, the panelists are willing to stay for a bit longer to talk to you individually if need be. But I just want to thank Father Paul, Alison, Dan, and Jane for a really amazing, beautiful examples of Christ's work in the world. So thank you for inspiring us and helping us be brave and think about what we can do next.